I'm not really sure about your question. You said it is actually easy to understand, but what is it that confuses you?
It's like I get it, but like for instance, like some of the examples he chose, like the week comes to be. Well, first of all, I don't agree with this whole it comes from the opposite thing in general. I don't think that's right. I think it's very just two-dimensional. It's like either black or white, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But like talking about itself, like I didn't really understand like the weaker comes to be from the stronger, and the swifter from the slower. And yeah, I just didn't agree with the way he put it.
I'm not really sure, like, what is your argument to disagree with it? Like, if some, I mean, it seems to be almost straightforward, logical. If something becomes faster, yeah, it was slower before. It can't be anything else. Otherwise, it would be faster, but not fast enough. It's almost like a contradiction.
Yeah, but then why would one become weaker if it was stronger before? That doesn't normally go with the whole course of how we
Uh,
work.
But it might not happen. But if it does, if we say, when you say, Jack, you got weaker, I necessarily assume you were stronger before, right?
Fair.
Can it be otherwise? Like, that it would contradict itself. I say, you are weaker now, but you were weaker before. I think that's what how I understand it. But if there's something else there that I'm not seeing, um, that's cool. But I'm not sure. This seems to be almost like a um, logical argument. Like if I tell you something, that if something smaller comes to be, if something smaller, smaller is already a smaller. It's already, what do you call that? Comparative. Um, in adjectives, English grammar, like comparative. Like if I say smaller, something is smaller than something else. And if it is smaller, the other thing must be bigger.
Yeah, I think I was interpreting this a bit differently than the way we're talking about it right now. But yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so tell me, because I'm interested in that. Like, it doesn't have to be. Like, nothing has to be. I mean, if you are thinking something stronger must be weaker, no, that's not the case. Something strong can get even stronger, etc. It doesn't have to be necessarily get smaller or weaker or something. But if it does, it necessarily, comparatively speaking, to the previous state. So you're right in thinking like, why should anything be weaker? It doesn't. It's not necessary that it does, but if it does, then that's the case. So I guess, like, of course, he is trying to articulate this in terms of the mortality and immortality, like the death and deathless, and the body and the soul. Of course, they are going to somehow, he's going to try to put them as opposite, and he will say the soul would not allow its opposite, because even though something can become larger and smaller, the large itself, which he believes exists, that's the kind of universal, or the form that he has in mind, in terms of which we understand equality. Like, so this also goes back to his argument about recollection. So when in math, the teacher said 2 plus 2 is equal 4, like imagine your first math class, did you say, what do you mean equal? What does that even mean? Have you ever asked this question? Because I always sort of concentrate on these moments in which, even as a child, or even like as any human being, you are saying, oh, equal, I understand it. Did anybody define to you, like in math, equality means something is the same as the other? And he was like, what do you mean same? What does that mean? I don't understand. I mean, as a child, you should ask those questions that your parents cannot answer. It's like, equal? What do you mean equal? Do you wonder, like, what is equal? What is 2 plus? 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. What does it even mean? Yeah.
I kind of had this experience once in 9th grade geometry, because my teacher started writing like the kind of squiggly equality signs. And I was like, what does that mean? And he was like, it means congruent to, because in geometry, we can't say that two objects are equal because they're two different objects. But in pure math, if you say 4 is equal to 4, it's the same 4. But if we say this angle is congruent to this angle, they're two different angles. And that fucked me up as a kid.
But you can express angle in numbers, right? 45 degrees is equal to 45 degrees, then it becomes math.
Yeah, but we didn't, he was like, you can't say that because they're not the same. And it was a weird distinction that he was making. But well, I don't know. That was the first time that I was ever actually told to think about what equal meant. And it was weird.
But you could also tell to your teacher, you could have told your teacher, well, by equal, I don't mean same. So yes, 4 is equal to 4 is different than 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, because 2 plus 2 is not 4, is not the same as 4. It's equal to 4. For that,
I think a mathematician would argue that it is literally equal to 4. That when you draw an equality sign in math, you are talking about things that are exactly equal, even though we as humans can see that no, the symbol's different, the thought process is different. These are distinct things. I think what pure mathematicians try to push for is this idea that these objects of different forms can literally be exactly the same.
Well, okay, so you are doing two things here, with which I agree, with one of which I agree, in the sense that they are equal. They are literally equal, sure. But then they are saying they are the same, which is a mathematical value in terms of equality, sure. Then you need to say 4 is equal to 4, as opposed to 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, which I can understand. 4 is 4. I can even understand that as sameness, although even with Hegel that will be problematic. But just let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say 4. But then 2 plus 2 is 4. It's an equality that somehow, this is the paradox of equality. If there is no difference, you would not ascertain equality. So the value that appears to be 2 plus 2 is 4, equal to 4, but that's 2 plus 2. It's not the same as 4. Therefore, I say they are equal. And that's the notion that in learning math, or even learning anything, when somebody says, you make the calculation and then you say 5 plus 4 is 9. And you say, okay. And then somebody says 6 times 7 is 42. It's like, why? Why is that? It doesn't appear to be same. 6 times 7. I don't even know what it means. I need to know multiplication to even make sense of that. So again, when somebody does that to you, that equality becomes pretty obvious. Yet when you think about this, this is Plato's argument that it seems to be a kind of remembrance. So you are already, you don't explain everything. And you can think about this in terms of logic too, in terms of other sort of teachings that we get in our education. We don't even question that basic premise, the transition. Yes.
So I feel like this connects to the passage that I wanted to talk about, which was at the bottom of page 113, which was the section about where, as far as I understand, Socrates is making the argument that what we were saying, that humans have some inherent knowledge of what's equal and what's greater and smaller, and then because those are fundamentally true concepts, capital equal, capital greater, capital smaller, then things like capital good, capital just, capital pious are also things that humans inherently know. And I think I'm having trouble seeing how those premises follow. I accept that humans have an inherent knowledge of the first set of things. I don't accept that they have an inherent knowledge of the second, because I feel like
What's
the
the second? I'm sorry, I was confused.
the group of things that includes the good, the just, the pious, things like that,
As opposed to,
as opposed to equal, greater, smaller.
well, of course, you are a scientist. That's what you need to say. That's correct. Because why? Because the first appears to be more easily demonstrable, or
Not that it's easily demonstrable. I just think that it is within us to be able to recognize those concepts. Like I think that we all can, and we all have always been able to. And I think that people also, they do have an inherent knowledge of the good, the just, the pious, things like that, and a knowledge of those things that's influenced by their surroundings. But I think even the fundamental internal knowledge of those things is individual. Like I think that
Huh.
the inherent sense of good that I was born with is different than the inherent sense of good that you were born with, and so on and so forth. Like I think in my experience being human, like people's ways of processing good or just are so vastly different that I feel like
I see. So
The-
there's more kind of subjective variation, you mean?
I mean, I don't know if subjective comes into it. I mean, I guess, but like I guess what I feel is that people's concepts of good are so different that even different um circumstances of being raised or surroundings or cultures wouldn't account for the difference if their fundamental understanding that they were born with were the same.
Okay, so just a couple of clarifications. Yeah, Isaac.
I was just going to add that I think Socrates might say that there might be certain values that all of those people have in common, and maybe that's what the capital G good is, and then everything else might be lowercase g.
Okay,
But I
that's
mean, do you think that there is one thing that like every single person on this planet has in common in their sense of what's good?
I mean, I think there seems to be some sense of like, don't kill people for no reason, don't steal for no reason, stuff like that.
But that's based on like an understanding of like what a good reason for doing one of those things might be.
okay. Is everybody following this question? Okay, just make sure. Yeah.
So, Olivia, are you kind of suggesting whether there are universal morals or universal values that every single person in the world has?
Basically, or rather like I just kind of I feel that the claim, because Socrates makes the claim that everyone has an inherent understanding of universal morals because people have inherent understandings of things like equal, good, or greater, smaller, and I don't really like. I guess whether or not there is a universal understanding of these morals, I don't think that the one argument follows from the other, because I think that in some way, like one is a process of basically spatial processing, I feel, and then the other is yeah, really sort of abstract moral judgments. And I feel like the argument from A to B doesn't quite follow for me.
The way I'm understanding is that I feel like Socrates is saying that like the universal aspect of it is that we all inherently recognize the concept of there being good and there being for like good, but then the way in which the things that we think are good are then the things that are like different from one another. But then we know that there is good and we know that there is bad. Whether or not we necessarily agree on what they are, it's just that we know that the thing exists inherently within us.
That's a really, okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's a really interesting way to, so what you're saying is like, it's that there is an understanding that there is such a thing as a good thing and as a bad thing. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can get behind that.
maybe a distinction might be helpful here. Usually when we talk about concepts in the way that Blessed was saying, we try to construct them empirically in the sense that, oh, I saw a good thing, I saw another good thing, I saw another good thing, then I came up with an idea of a good thing. But the problem here for Plato seems to be, how is it possible to even see the first thing as good without having that conception? Their concept becomes a condition for the possibility of even having the first recognition, rather than after the recognition you put them together, right? So that might be a useful analysis. When I say good, you say like, what do you mean? And you have some kind of delimitation of that good, that even though you have never seen the good or the beautiful and nobody agrees what is good, what is beautiful, as Blessed was saying, I don't confuse good with beautiful. I know they are different. I know why. And I distinguish ugly from bad, or I can make these distinctions conceptually without necessarily having seen anything, I mean, that we agree on, like, you know, what you consider to be even ugly. And I started thinking actually, well, anyway, so yeah, so that's the distinction. Anybody has anything else to add to that? That's a good discussion. And that's why, in that sense, Socrates finds equal parallel to good, in the sense that nobody has to even teach you, can teach you equal as merely a concept, because then you need to cover a lot of equal things in order to teach that concept empirically, which we seem to have a sense of it. Yes, Kate.
Does Socrates, like, I guess this is one thing I'm getting kind of confused on, believe in the concept of like an objective good, like there is some construct of good that is not made by humans, like there's something that in the universe, just like a standard of morality, which I think, I mean, kind of reflects on the idea of like the gods and stuff as maybe being the one that designates that? Or is he saying that, I mean, there is some subjective, humanly constructed concept of good that everybody can get behind?
What's the difference?
I mean, like, so is there good that exists independent of humans and then all humans try to live up to that standard, or do humans themselves set that standard and they all then try to live up to it?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question of Plato interpretation, of course. A lot of people after Plato, with the reading of Plato, proposed that he has a theory of ideas, and philosophers talked about that theory of ideas, theory of forms, believing that there are actually such things existing. And of course, their ontological status, the way in which they exist, is different than like how this wallet exists or this pen exists, right? You cannot sort of say that somewhere in the sky they are flowing or something like that. I think fundamentally it is conceptual, in the sense that there is a distinction between what people consider to be good and the good itself. Now, you don't need to hypothesize and sort of make it a thing out of it, but you can think of it as a concept. And then that's obviously the philosophical question, what kind of ontological status it has. It is comfortable to say, well, everybody makes a different judgment, which is a kind of lazy statement, actually. Like, everybody considered what is good differently. It's sort of like, how do you know that? Like, we don't even know that. So we make these situations like overly dramatic so that we say that, oh, there can never be a common understanding of the good. But I guess that's a kind of practice too. And if we practice that, if we practice difference and different judgment, etc., it might happen that we have different conceptions of good. But if we practice together what we consider to be good and practice to make it common, then it might become common. So it's a very complicated question in terms of what it actually is. I don't, like a lot of also people that I'm part of, like don't believe that Plato has that theory of forms very well thought out and kind of articulated. It's more like Platonism, which interprets Plato in a certain way and makes Plato into something that he is not. But that's also a kind of internal philosophical debate and question. So when you ask, does Socrates have that? Socrates, I think, as Socrates certainly didn't have it because he didn't write anything except these poems apparently that he wrote, poetry that he wrote in this dialogue, which should say something like Socrates is writing. Socrates is someone who never wrote anything, and in this dialogue, Plato says Socrates wrote poetry. Socrates says that he is writing poetry, which is kind of bizarre. Like, you are not supposed to write anything, Socrates, but you're definitely not supposed to write poetry. So that's it. Yeah, again, I'm not answering your question, obviously, because that's really, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I'm not necessarily looking for like a strict answer. I was just curious to hear thoughts on it. But one thing I guess I'm kind of wondering is like a question that springs from what you've said. So we've talked about the idea of like a universal type of good. Like, I know that someone mentioned the concept of like, we generally think that killing for no reason is a bad thing. But what if all humans just collectively woke up tomorrow and decided, okay, we can just kill without a reason and that's going to be fine? If we all agree to it, does killing without reason become the new moral good?
purge.
Like, or would Socrates argue like, hey, even though you all agreed that it's okay to kill people, it's still a bad thing?
I think that there's a difference between what is good and judging killing for no reason is not good. That's a judgment. And you're right. I mean, I don't even think that there is such a judgment. I mean, you don't need to wait until the purge tomorrow. I think people are killing each other and thinking that it's good. And, people are thinking killing terrorists are good, killing enemies are good. We celebrate it. We just don't call it killing because that might, we don't call it murder. It might cause some problems. But that's like, again, a judgment. That's a judgment about killing. It's not a judgment about good, right? So good still is a predicate of a judgment. It remains there. We still understand what it is. Okay, Nancy, go ahead.
Something I was wondering about, and probably won't be able to word very well, and connected, maybe you just answered it in saying that it's the difference between a judgment and something that is actually good, but I'm confused about, is there a difference between good as a kind of end and then good as a means? Because it seems like quite often politically we might be able to agree on a certain end that is good, and then the disagreement is more often about like how we should get there. The example that I was thinking of is like most people would say it's good to have representation in government, and then what people disagree on is if that's something we should prioritize with quotas and that kind of stuff, or if that's bad for another reason. But yeah, just if there's a difference.
Oh, certainly. I think that some of you actually studied Kant and Kant's moral philosophy as good in itself, as opposed to good for the sake of something else. Certainly. Now, even that kind of distinction that you are making, which is a valid distinction, presupposes that you have an idea about good. Presupposes that you have some understanding of the good. Like when people say, just again, quite lazy, like everybody has their own definition of good. It's like definition is not a sort of arbitrary judgment about one particular thing. Definition is something common and universal, because I don't confuse good with ugly. I don't confuse good with blue. I don't confuse good with, like, if we all had a definition on our own heads, then you wouldn't even understand the distinction between good in itself and good for something else. Like, how do you make that distinction? Right? So that understanding is, we are confusing the conceptual understanding of how we use the concept of good with a judgment of saying whether something is good or not. Sure, we make I mean, even there, we are like becoming increasingly more uniform, unfortunately, in the world, which is annoying, but we can have differences, right? So we can say this is good, no, this is not good. But that's a judgment about the this. It's not a judgment about the good. And this is good in itself. Yeah, go ahead.
So then there could be some actions that are good in themselves, but don't contribute towards a good end. But then it seems like,
Possibly.
how can they be good in, sorry?
Possibly.
Yeah, but then it seems like that's kind of a bit of a contradiction, because can they be good in themselves if then what they lead to isn't necessarily good?
Sure. I mean, you read Kant, good intentions.
It just doesn't seem that good if it doesn't lead to something good.
Well, how would you know? I mean, Kant's argument, you read it last semester, right? Last year. Like, how would I know what I do is going to lead to good? I'm not a fortune teller. I can just do what is best, that I consider to be best intention now. And whether the consequence is going to be good or not, I don't control that. Laws of nature control that.
But
So
if we're going to,
go ahead.
if we're going to talk about kind of an ultimate good and bad that is something outside of our human constructs, then surely it doesn't matter what we understand or not in order to make that judgment about if it's good or bad.
Sure. I think that there is a distinction. So there is the concept of the good, and you are trying to find something that is absolutely good. But you are still trying to find something that is absolutely good. Plato is talking about the good itself. And that's the difficulty. The concept doesn't change whether you can find an example of that concept or not. You still know what good is. But you cannot find an example in the world that is absolutely good. Sure. But you know the concept. And sometimes your concept changes. I mean, that's the problem. Like when you judge something to be good or bad, even two people judging something good or bad, two people, the opposite judgments, they are using the same concept of good. If they were not using the same concept of good, they wouldn't even make opposite judgments. That's the conceptual understanding. That's the good itself. Now, I can't find, and you can be cynical, there is no good. People say that, oh, that's just, people are terrible, they make terrible things. It's not good. The irony is that you could not even be cynical. You couldn't even complain about this unless you had an idea of the good. Because if there is no good, how do you know it's not good? I mean, that's the paradox, right? Like, there's nothing good in the world. It's like, if there is nothing good in the world, you cannot really make a judgment like that. That's the paradox of being cynical about something. Actually, the cynical people are more committed to the idea. It's just that they cannot find the example in the world. And the idea that he is interested in, the idea that he is articulating. So there's no justice in the world. It's like, if there were no justice in the world, what are you talking about? Where are you coming from? What example are you referring to? If there is no example, what is the concept you are referring to if you say there is no justice in the world? That's conceptually impossible. So you are appealing to some understanding of justice that never finds its example in the world. And that's what he is interested in. And in that sense, yes, it doesn't have as much possibility of demonstration as equality, for example. And I think Olivia's point is still valid, that there are differences among these concepts. And I still believe like equality is more of a uncontroversial thing than beautiful. Yet their function as concepts are the same. And the ultimate thing, the soul is like that too. So soul as a concept, as a form, which has examples in each one of us, is the same. And that's the most difficult part, because we operate with individualized different souls. And I keep pushing being able to think this oneness of the soul as a concept. So if you say, I mean, if you are not like a Spanish colonialist and grant the fact that I have a soul, then I could say, I have a soul, you have a soul. What do they make them both souls? How do we even talk about it in the same way?
I'm not sure it is the same because a lot of people don't believe that souls exist, right?
Okay, are you alive?
Yes.
Am I alive?
Yes.
Okay, let's go with that then. Maybe soul is just a principle of life. It's not a thing, of course. I don't believe that there is a ghost figure like Casper, like my soul going to heaven or something, but we are both alive. And we think that there's a principle in which both of us are alive in the same way. Olivia, do you have to add something to that? Yeah.
Yeah, so like I also don't believe in a literal soul, but I think that I think the concept of a soul is pretty universal because I think that we all recognize in other people a fundamental set of like something deeper than outward characteristics or behaviors that make them who they are. And I think that we also to some degree recognize that in ourselves, and like that there's some sort of kind of inseparable through line running through each person. I think that's at least how I interpret it when we talk about the concept of a universal concept of a soul, is this idea of like that there is something fundamental about a person and who they are.
Well, that's okay. I'm not gonna say much about that. That's again philosophically problematic because you are still kind of something not visible, but it is there somehow. It's not visible, but somewhere lies deep in like personality or characteristics, etc. Like the concepts that psychologists like to talk about, personality, etc. I think maybe the difficulty is that here's the thing. So think about this way. So I have a lot of books in front of me, right? This is a book, this is a book, this is a book, this is a book. And I said, they are all books. That creates a unity, which for Plato, something like, there is something common to all of them by virtue of which we call all of them books. In the same way, 2 plus 2 is 4, 6 plus 6 is 12, 8 plus 8 is 16, is that equality sign. We say, well, they are not the same because 2 plus 2 is not the same as 4 plus 4, but they all equal in the same way. There's a concept of equality, right? Then the question is, we have a unity, whatever that is. Don't look at it in sort of deep structures of our personality, etc., by virtue of which I call the person the person. Jared was the same Jared who was Jared last semester or last year. Principle of life. Even after the person dies, not you, but one person, we continue to attribute some kind of unity to that person. And we believe that me being alive, me having a unity of my life, my impressions, experiences, etc., is kind of similar the way you are. I'm not alive in a completely different way than you are. What is that unity? What is that unity that unifies us, that we call life and my life as opposed to life itself? Now, again, it's a conceptual question. We cannot point out to some gigantic soul somewhere in the universe that we are going to jump like we are jumping into a pool, but it is some unity. How is that unity possible? What is that unity? That's the question. And Plato believes, or at least implies, that that unity exceeds the particular unities of our own bodies. From that, all the possibilities of monotheism, the being of all beings, God, etc. follow. Yeah.
So, I mean, I recognize that there's like we all have an inherent understanding in the way that we inherently understand, like, that there are things that are equal or good. Like, that we all have an inherent understanding that there are things that are alive and not alive. So are you saying that that is fundamentally the same concept of things that have souls or don't have souls, or is there a subtlety that I'm missing here?
I read the soul as the principle of unity of the body. Yeah.
Okay.
In a very non-substantial way. It's the unity. Like, so because for us, it sounds a little difficult to accept some non-physical thing existing. We still think of it as a kind of cloud or something like that. We still make it physical, but it's just a unity. Like, you know, what makes me me? What has been making me me for 50 plus years? What is that? Is there some? It's not something that I can hold on to, and everything else changes, like my body, my face, etc. Everything changes, and even I don't even remember what I used to do when I was 5 years ago. But there's some unity to that. What is that unity? And if you ask about it, I mean, this is very, the way in which you formulate that the question, it's a pretty obvious thing that we take for granted every day in our existence. But when you ask the question, it becomes uncanny. Like, what is that really? Yeah.
So you're saying that, like, if some dork were to be like, oh, you know, all the cells in your body like die and regenerate every few years, so how do you say that you're even the same person? Like, the thing that makes you the same person and binds that all together is the soul.
Yes, I would say that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, it's a question for me. It's not like an answer, but yeah. But there is a unity that I presuppose it. Somehow presuppose it. Just like I presuppose equality. Yes, Blessed.
Okay, so I think I understand the argument for the unity or like of the soul in terms of like us being alive. My question is then, like, so is Plato then saying then in death, like the way to like still maintain the oneness of the soul, is that like through like practicing philosophy? Or then, like, so if you don't practice philosophy, then you like kind of then become detached. Like, I also like acknowledge that it's hard for me to like think about it another way because of like post-Christian like thing, in the sense that like you have to do something on earth to then go to God and everything like that. And if you don't, then there's consequences for that. But then I want to understand like what happens then if you like ignore, because we acknowledge that not everyone can then like practice philosophy in the same way, or practice philosophy. So then what happens to the soul? Like, are you then like separate from the one?
I guess, okay, that when I watched the classes later on, I realized I don't always understand your questions, and then I answer something and I sound very stupid. So to me, so can you formulate that question again for me? Because I don't want to assume that I understood it. So are you asking like, what happens to your soul if you don't practice philosophy? Is that?
Yeah. It's kind of like a two-part question. The first part is that like, if you practice philosophy, is that how we maintain the oneness that we've acknowledged as like being alive, like after death? And then if you don't, then what happens?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think for Plato, philosophy is, later poets like Hölderlin in 19th century said, it's gathering your soul. It's really gathering that unity. We can read it like that. So that's why it is a practice, in the sense that when you are living according to the desires, passions, and being pulled to every direction, and like having all sorts of concerns, anxieties, problems, issues, scattered life. And philosophers' life is this more kind of, for the lack of a better word, introspective, kind of trying to gather all those parts together, having a unity to your soul. That's how we might be able to think the idea of the practice of death. Now, why is that death? Not because you are going to disappear, like you are going to kill yourself, why don't you kill yourself, etc. But it is gathering your soul, like gathering your gathering, gathering your unity. Because the act of soul is the act of gathering. So what does that mean? Like, this is difficult to explain, but you know, like at moments that you are engaged with philosophy, or later on what we call like spiritual activity, blah, blah, spiritual exercise, is that you have this center, you have this unity, you have this oneness. You believe that your life actually has some unity. And for the most part, we are scattered. And this is how Hadot reads Plato. That's how Hadot reads philosophy, as a way of life, as a life in which you gather your soul, you produce this unity. Yeah, so I don't know whether it's a good answer. I don't know whether it satisfies what you are, because, you know, it's not like he's saying like practice philosophy, otherwise you are, well, you're all gonna die, whether you practice philosophy or not. I mean, we're all gonna die. It doesn't really matter in that sense. But when you do practice philosophy, it's more like that, in which there is a unity of the soul that is detached to a certain extent, of course, from the body. That's why the definition of the soul as separation becomes significant, because that separation is something that you can experience in life by gathering your soul. And again, that doesn't mean you should just not do the bodily things, but the way in which you do those bodily things, and rather than being lost in those scattered things. And this is particularly to me interesting in the 21st century, when our lives are more and more defined in terms of a crisis. So we live so scattered brain until we are a certain age, then we realized, oh, where did my life go? We call it a crisis. So I should say this. Caitlin, do you have something?
We kind of like covered my question already, because I was just gonna ask, because like on page 107, it like talks about the soul and like death and living. So I was just wondering like how they even know that we have a soul, because they keep talking about like what happens with it, and I just didn't know how they knew that first part.
Yeah. If we don't look at the soul as a thing. Now, of course, this is very problematic, because nobody has a soul. I mean, we should at least be egalitarian. We should not say only Christians and the Spaniards have soul and the natives don't have soul, or something like that. But no one can have it in the same of a possession. Like, this is my soul, I grab it, or something like that. But the experience of unity in your life, and this idea of unity is crucial, is the more soulful you are. I mean, of course, that sounds a little bit kind of problematic too, but not to think soul as a thing, but as the practice of unity, gathering your soul, so to speak, gathering your dispersion to different activities in the world in terms of your desires, needs, involvements, etc. That's how we define ourselves. Your position in society, your possessions, your relationships, your accomplishments, your money, your estate, etc. We are all sort of scattered into this way of being in which we are everywhere except in our center. And I think maybe soul, and then we presume that, you know, we everybody said like, yes, you might be scattered, all of these things, but there is a unity to these. It makes you the same person. And philosophy maybe is practicing of gathering that unity in life. Because you can think of death as this internal collapse, like you are going to collapse into that by being detached from every involvement that you are in life. I mean, right? So this is a wonderful thought, actually, that I definitely would recommend. Like, if you have these incredible problems, issues, embarrassments, problems with other people, etc., and you can think of, oh, I can just die now, and all of them will collapse into this one unity, and none of them are really significant. Like, after you die, like, who cares whether you paid the electricity bill? Like, you know, somebody will pay it or not. I cannot like live in this scattered life.
Does that, if our soul is the unity, doesn't that suggest that, or does that suggest that some people can then have more soul because they have more unity? So if you're a philosopher, you basically have more soul, and it's like everyone has some kind of unity, but then you can work on getting more and having more of a soul.
Well, I wouldn't say philosopher has a soul, has more soul. I think that maybe the idea of wisdom is that maybe wise, the sage, Thales, which was considered to be a sage, right? They might have more soul, whatever, like you cannot quantify really the soul. But certainly practicing that and trying to be that, that's the love of wisdom. Love is really living out that love by practicing philosophy. Yes, that would be the consequence. But I mean, you understand that it is problematic to quantify soul. I have more soul than you are. That sounds like a weird competition. Or you have more soul than I have. I didn't mean like. That's a good question, though. Certainly, like, Christians believe that if you are closer to God, you have a soul, and these people don't know Jesus Christ, therefore they don't have a soul. Do they have a soul? Maybe a little bit of a soul. Like, finally they decided they do have a soul, right? I mean, that was the edict, for those of you who know the history of Spanish conquest. Then they decided, okay, they have soul, fine. We won't kill them. I mean, we'll kill them, but their souls might be saved. Yes, Isaac.
There seems to definitely be some sort of discrimination that Plato has between different souls, but he just says, like, those that practice philosophy, there's more of a separation between soul and body. And then so when you die, your soul can just leave unimpeded. And I think that kind of connects back to what we were talking about earlier, in that just because there's a discrimination between the different souls doesn't mean that there isn't a universal conception of soul.
Yeah.
That still unites us.
Yeah, it gets actually much worse when you come to the Republic, in which there are souls that are like courageous and therefore they should be the guardians, and then there are philosophers' soul, like, and then there's just like worker souls who like just work and division of labor. So you're like, there's a gold, there's a bronze, there's a silver and a bronze soul. So whenever I watch the Olympics and people getting gold, silver, bronze medal, I always think of Plato and how he gives those according to your soul. So the one who earns the gold medal is the gold soul. So probably that's where it's coming from too, actually, given that Olympics comes from Olympia and from the ancient Greece. So we kind of do that. Yeah, there is at least very plausible claim that there's a hierarchy among the souls in Plato. And he does. I mean, he's not sort of this garden variety 21st century on the surface egalitarian, because Socrates was killed, and by a very democratic process in which people made judgments, which is really problematic. And in the 21st century United States, you are probably experiencing the same kind of feelings that, okay, I should also